Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 136, RuneQuest and Glorantha. Before we get into this week's deep dive, I wanted to take an opportunity to apologize for the audio issues in last week's show. As I noted in the info box last week, we made some changes in the studio, and since I tend to record so late in the week, I hadn't had a chance to get all the kinks worked out, so I was forced to adjust on the fly. I think I've got things worked out, so hopefully things sound better this week. Fingers crossed. So with things fixed, let's move on, get the tour bus cranked up, and get to today's topics. RuneQuest is a fantasy game developed by Steve Perrin, Ray Turney, Steve Henderson, and Warren James, and was originally published by The Chaosium in 1978. It's set in the mythical world of Glorantha, which was created by Greg Stafford, and we'll discuss that later on in today's show. Let's back up a hair to cover the history of RuneQuest from its inception. In 1975, Greg Stafford released a fantasy board game titled White Bear and Red Moon, which he later changed to Dragon Pass. The game was produced and marketed by The Chaosium, which was Stafford's company he created specifically to sell the game. As I mentioned in the open for our deep dive, 1978 saw the release of the tabletop game RuneQuest, which was set in Glorantha, and Stafford had created that setting for use in White Bear and Red Moon. 1979 saw a second edition of RuneQuest make its way to market. There were some revisions made, though everyone agrees they were minor ones. By this point, RuneQuest was considered to be the second most popular fantasy role-playing game in the world, behind only Dungeons & Dragons. Over the next 4 years, more than 20 different supplements were produced and released to support the second edition of the game. By the way, in 2015, all of the second edition releases from the rulebook itself to the various supplements were republished as a part of the RuneQuest Classic Kickstarter. In 1984, Chaosium realized that if they wanted RuneQuest to keep pace with Dungeons & Dragons in any meaningful way, they were going to need to increase their distribution and marketing capabilities. So, they made a deal with Avalon Hill. This agreement led to Avalon Hill publishing the third edition of the game that year. However, the agreement was a bit, let's just say, different. Avalon Hill got the trademark rights for RuneQuest, but all the Glorantha-related content required approval from Chaosium, and Chaosium also kept the copyright for the rules text. So with all that in mind, the default setting for the third edition was the Dark Ages of Fantasy Europe. But there was a booklet that allowed for play in Glorantha thanks to the arrangement with Chaosium. And I'm sure there was absolutely no confusion amongst the gaming populace with that at all. Just check out the comments online about third edition. I mean, go ahead. There were a ton of supplements published for third edition, but even these were a mismatch. Some were generic fantasy, and they were basically left unbranded. There were some marked as Earth, some were marked as Glorantha, and there were some marked as Gateway, which were intended to be an alternative fantasy. The idea was that by marking the supplements this way, or not to mark them, they were going to differentiate them from each other. And again, this didn't confuse gamers in any way, I'm sure. And again, check out the comments online about third edition. Avalon Hill proposed a fourth edition of RuneQuest in 1994. Called RuneQuest Adventures in Glorantha, it was intended to return the game back to its original relationship with the rules and the setting, but Stafford pulled the plug on the game by refusing to allow it to be published. His stated reason for doing so was his unhappiness with the way Avalon Hill had handled third edition. Avalon Hill responded to Stafford's rejection by utilizing their trademark right to RuneQuest by developing a game that didn't use any of the mechanics of the game, since they didn't own the rights to those, and they intended to call it RuneQuest Slayers. In the middle of development, however, Avalon Hill was purchased by Hasbro in 1998. Now, even though the game was almost finished, Hasbro pulled the plug, and the copyrights to the rules that had been developed reverted back to the authors who'd been working on it to that point. In an almost spiteful move, they decided to release the game for free and called it Runeslayers. Now, for the record, you can still find Runeslayers online for free as a PDF download. Just type Runeslayers into the search engine of your choice and follow the links to the download source of your choice. I say it that way because I know there are some questionable sites out there, and I don't want to promote one over the other because I've made some poor choices myself on that a time or two. Now, I know I mentioned this next piece of history when I covered the history of Chaosium back in the Chaosium episode a while back, but it does bear mentioning again. In 1998, the collectible card game Mythos failed, and it failed badly. Now, that wasn't necessarily news in the collectible card game market at the time, since a number of CCGs failed at that period of time in the game market. What was news is that Greg Stafford and Sandy Peterson, who was also a shareholder in Chaosium, decided to leave the management of the company, though they did keep their shares in Chaosium. Now, previous to his departure from the company, Stafford had created a subsidiary company, Isaris Incorporated, to manage the Glorantha property, and when he left Chaosium, he took that company with him. Once he was free of Chaosium, he teamed up with Robin D. Laws to design a new game system based in Glorantha for publication. They called it Hero Wars and released it in 2000. Now, why did I mention the new game and system? Hero Wars was renamed HeroQuest in 2003 after that name, along with the RuneQuest trademark, were picked up from Hasbro by Isaris Incorporated. So, basically, Stafford got his stuff back. For the most part. You'll see in a minute. Let's get back to RuneQuest specifically. Mongoose Publishing got into the act in 2006. They released the 4th edition that year after getting a license from Isaris. They had the task of trying to recreate all of the form and function of the prior editions without using the prior texts of those games, since those were still under the copyright by Chaosium. Not an easy task, but also not impossible. Mongoose co-founder Matthew Sprang led the team who tackled the task, and the new rules were released under the Open Game license. Also, the official setting for 4th edition was the Second Age of Glorantha, which was one of the ways the creative team worked around the copyright issues, since all of the previous editions were set in the Third Age. 2010 saw the 5th edition of RuneQuest. This edition was heavily revised, and Pete Nash and Lawrence Whitaker handled the work for Mongoose. It also got a title adjustment, RuneQuest 2, though many gamers have taken to referring to it as MRQ2. Not me, but a number of sources I saw online refer to it as such. To each their own, I suppose. A year later, Mongoose Publishing and Isaris announced that they'd severed their partnership, and Mongoose changed the title of RuneQuest 2 to Legend. Legend was re-released in late 2011 under the OGL. All Mongoose titles for RuneQuest 2 that had previously been released were re-released as Legend-compatible books. As a quick aside, if you caught that episode we did on the history of Chaosium, you know things were pretty messy concerning relationships with other publishing companies over the years, and the licensing rights and stuff like that. RuneQuest was one of the titles that got caught up in all of that, so I hope you've got your scorecard ready, because it keeps getting messier from here, so buckle up your chin strap. In July of 2011, a company formed by Pete Nash and Lawrence Whitaker, The Design Mechanism, announced they'd made a licensing agreement with Isaris that would allow them to produce the 6th edition of RuneQuest. They released it in July of 2012. It was basically just an expansion of RuneQuest 2, which makes sense since they were the ones who'd handled the development of those rules. Their goal with 6th edition was to make it usable for pretty much any fantasy or historical setting, and to not include any specific Gloranthan content. Funny enough, though, they did use Gloranthan runes. In 2013, Stafford decided to sell Isaris. Not only that, he sold the Glorantha setting, the RuneQuest trademark, and the HeroQuest trademark. The lucky buyers? Moon Design Publications. They had published the 2nd edition of HeroQuest under license back in 2009. As part of the deal, Moon Design agreed to maintain Design Mechanism's RuneQuest license. In June of 2015, Chaosium found itself in a bind. They'd had some serious money problems, and Greg Stafford and Sandy Peterson took the opportunity to retake control of the company. Once they'd done that, they arranged a merger with Moon Design, which allowed the Moon Design management team to take over Chaosium. In other words, all of the creative rights of RuneQuest were now back under one roof. Neat trick. In 2016, the Design Mechanism announced they'd split with Moon Design and would continue to publish the 6th edition of RuneQuest under the name Mithras. So, Chaosium, or Moon Design if you'd prefer, decided it was time for a 7th edition. Titled RuneQuest, Role-Playing in Glorantha, it's based heavily on the 2nd edition of the game, which, if you'll remember, was also a Chaosium release, though it does draw on ideas from the later editions. It got a preview on Free RPG Day in 2017, with a PDF release of the full rules in May of 2018, and the print book release later in the year. Since that release, Role-Playing in Glorantha has seen a consistent release of supplements released to support it, and sales continued to be strong. And rumors online are that we might be seeing an 8th edition of the game later in 2024, or maybe early in 2025, but we all know what they say about rumors. That being said, I'll keep my ear to the ground, and if more news on this comes up, I will be sure to let you know. RuneQuest Role-Playing in Glorantha should be available at your local game shop. If it's not, see if they will order it for you. If they can't get it, you can get it from the Chaosium website, chaosium.com. When I checked the site right before I recorded, they did have the hardcover in stock for about $55. I would note for our US listeners that it will be shipping from the UK, so expect a fairly hefty shipping fee, but for a game of this quality, it will be well worth it. Okay, so let's take a quick moment to get our heads to stop spinning from the crazy history of RuneQuest and Chaosium before we jump into the system behind the game itself. Let me get a drink. All right, I think that's long enough. Now, while I could go through all of the various systems RuneQuest has used over the past 40 years, I think the best use of my time today is to cover the system from the current edition of the game. So let's pop the hood on Role-Playing in Glorantha and see what makes her purr. Building a character works a lot like it does in pretty much every role-playing game out there, though the process in RuneQuest starts with the player creating a family history for their character. Once they do that, they create the character through the familiar series of die rolls for their various characteristics. And of course, skills and powers are increased through play, but not as quickly or as high as in other games, and certainly not to the extent as they are in D&D. However, it is still possible for a weaker or lower level, if you will, character to kill a stronger or higher level character or monster through luck, tactics, or planning. Task resolution uses 3 systems: simple, opposed, and resistance rolls. All 3 are percentile based, and all 3 are the roll under method. For those who don't know what that means, roll under means you roll equal to or under the number given to succeed at the given task. Bonuses can be given to increase or decrease the target number depending on the type of action taken, and success or failure is subdivided into categories based on the target number, and that works like this. Critical success, which is 1/20th of the target number. Special success, which is 1/5 of the target number. Success, which is the target number or less. Failure, which is above the target number and specifically 96 to 100. Fumble, which is 1/20th above the target number and specifically 100. Now, I'm not a math guy, which I've both said and proven on more than one occasion on this show, so I'll leave working all that out to you, but I think you've got this. So let's talk combat, since we all seem to love us some combat. The idea behind combat is to recreate live-action combat in a tabletop form as closely as possible, and that's based on Steve Perrin's familiarity with mock medieval combat through the Society for Creative Anachronism. By the way, look them up because that's a very interesting group of folks. A combat round is divided into strike ranks. Those give an initiative based on the character's dexterity, size, and weapons, and then those are lined up sequentially. The attacker rolls their skill, and if they succeed, the defender can either parry or dodge the attack. There's also a subsystem for hit location. Now, we've discussed other games that have these types of systems, and if you followed Season 2 of Bad GM's campaign Build Along, the Fallout role-playing game has one as well, and much like that game, in RuneQuest, the body part you get hit in has a very specific effect on the mechanics of the game and the narrative moving forward. Now, at the time, this was a very innovative concept, as no other role-playing game on the market was doing it, and it set RuneQuest apart from D&D, and numerous gamers and game historians have noted it's one of the things that helped propel it into the number 2 spot in the fantasy role-playing game world. Now, I mentioned character advancement a moment or two ago, but I did have a little something I wanted to add to that, and this seemed like the place to do it. As with everything else in RuneQuest, percentile dice are used for advancement, and unlike pretty much every other game out there, ability advancement is done directly. In other words, if a player wants to improve a skill, they need to roll a score greater than their current score in the ability in order to improvement. Now, of course, they also need to have been doing that particular thing a few times before they can actually make that roll, but you get the idea. Advancement is about doing and advancing in real time rather than just cashing in experience points. Again, it's a more realistic feeling game. Of course, no matter how realistic you're trying to make your fantasy game, you can't really have one without magic in it, and RuneQuest is no exception. That being said, there is a difference between RuneQuest and D&D. Characters in RuneQuest aren't separated from those who have magic and those who don't, which was very unique at the time that the game was first released. Everybody has access to magic to some extent. For practical reasons, though, the character's ability to actually use magic is directly tied to their strength, or ties, if you will, to the divine or natural skills of sorcery. Now, it needs to be noted that all characters in the world of Glorantha have a connection of some sort to the various runes of Glorantha, and the runes are used when casting magic. The rune allows the player to roll to actually cast the spell, though they need to roll under their affinity for that particular ability, such as someone using a fire rune using their fire rune affinity. Each edition of the game uses different divisions of magic, but this edition focuses specifically on spirit magic, rune magic, and sorcery. There is a thing called dragon magic, but it's not normally available to characters. Just keep that in mind. When you look at the types of fantasy monsters in RuneQuest, you'll see some of the familiar types like dwarves and trolls. There are also some originals like Brew, which are goat-headed creatures, and Maidstone archers, which are headless three-armed giants. Also, some of the traditional fantasy creatures were altered for RuneQuest. Elves were altered to be humanoid plant life. And in a shift from D&D, monsters were encouraged to be used as characters in the game. With some of the character creation covered, let's take a look at a bit of the setting for the game. Now, I'm going to be doing a bit of deep diving into the history of the creation of Glorantha and what it's all about momentarily, but it doesn't hurt to do a bit of a primer here, so let's get into it. As I've mentioned more than once to this point in the show, Glorantha's been the setting for all but one of the editions of the game, and because of that, there's a ton of material out there for players and GMs to utilize when laying out scenarios to run their players through or to create backgrounds to create their characters from. And thanks to the origins of Glorantha, it was very well detailed before RuneQuest even came into being, so players already had a wealth of knowledge to draw from in the first edition of the game, which put it well ahead of games like D&D at the time, since Glorantha was a much more developed setting than even Gygax's Greyhawk was at that time. The Dragon Pass region of Glorantha is the default setting for the majority of RuneQuest adventures, and it provides a variety of geographical, political, philosophical, and cultural ideals and locales that make for interesting storytelling and compelling adventures. Now, I could go deeper into all of this, but you know what? I'm going to leave it for you to pick up a copy of the game and check out for yourself. I mean, after all, if I detailed it all here, you wouldn't need a copy of the game, right? Now, you know me and my love of reviews, so let's get a few in. And this week, I decided to grab a couple spanning several editions just so we get a feel for what reviewers have thought over the 40-year history of the game. In the September-October 1978 edition of the Space Gamer, Dana Holmes stated, quote, "Since this game contains a logical system, almost anything can be added to the matrix it presents. A gem of a game, you won't be disappointed," end quote. So that covers first edition. Second edition reviews were positive, but not quite as enthusiastic. Eric Goldberg had this to say in the July 1980 issue of Ares, quote, "When RQ came out, it was well organized by the FRP standards of that time. The rules are not painful to read, and a second edition in which the charts are easier to find has helped matters considerably. The drawbacks of the game are that the foundation of the game, combat, has play problems, and that the individual systems do not mesh together as nicely as one would hope. Among the strengths are its freshness of design concepts, the eliminations of the odious level progressions for characters, and the detailed background," end quote. Look, I could continue to do an edition-by-edition set of reviews, but I'll close out this section with one final review, and this is for the 6th edition. And it comes from John O'Neill, who reviewed it for Blackgate in January of 2014. He said, quote, "The interior art is terrific throughout, and the writing is crisp and clear. Like all the best role-playing books, RuneQuest 6th edition is fascinating to flip through, even if you're not a fantasy gamer," end quote. One thing to keep in mind about RuneQuest is that Chaosium understood they had a winning formula on their hands. Greg Stafford and Lynn Willis took the core of that system and published it as basic role-playing in 1980, and we did cover that in a previous show. That system was used to power a lot of other games for Chaosium. Just a few of those games are Stormbringer, which dropped in 1981, Call of Cthulhu, that was also in 81, Worlds of Wonder in 1982, Superworld in 1983, ElfQuest in 1984, Ringworld in 1984, Pendragon in 85, Hawkmoon in 85, and Nephilium in 1992. So even though you might not have ever played or even heard of RuneQuest, chances are you've played a game built on the rules that were created for it. RuneQuest's legacy continues to live on to this day, and it continues to be sold and played around the world. All right, so we've spent the entire show to this point talking about RuneQuest, and while we've been talking about it, we keep getting into the subject of Glorantha and it being the setting and what a big deal it's been throughout RuneQuest's history. We even covered how Glorantha had its own trademark and licensing deals. So, what's the big deal? What's Glorantha all about? Well, I tell you what, as somebody who always wanted to be a history teacher, let's crank up another history lesson and we'll figure this all out together. Glorantha's beginnings actually go all the way back to 1966. That's when Greg Stafford started at Belvoir College and wanted to better understand the concepts of mythology. He decided to do that by creating a mythology of his own. Much like George Lucas did later on when he created the concept of the Force, Stafford was influenced by the thoughts of Joseph Campbell when he was creating his philosophies, and many have noticed themes of Campbell in certain areas of Glorantha, including the stories of Prince Argrath as an exploration of Campbell's 1949 work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Now, as I noted earlier, Glorantha first appeared in the board game White Bear and Red Moon. The game laid out a time of constant war between the land of Sartar and the Lunar Empire during the reign of Argrath Dragontooth. This was the first appearance of Dragon Pass, and the rulebook for the game gave the details of the various factions, their lands, and their leaders. There was also a map included called the Greater Lunar Empire. That was the initial look at the larger world that Dragon Pass was a part of. Now, while the game was set in Glorantha, the name never referred to the world by that name. Glorantha appeared in board game form again, this time in the 1978 Chaosium release Nomad Gods. This time the raids and wars between the various tribes of Prax were the troops utilized, and again Glorantha wasn't mentioned by name. However, Prax was given a location in that unnamed world, as it was noted to be a cursed land located to the east of Dragon Pass. Later on in 1978, between the publishing of Nomad Gods and shortly before RuneQuest made its appearance on the scene, we finally saw the name Glorantha make its first appearance in print when Worms Footnotes number 4 was printed. It had 3 articles that specifically covered the world, printed the name Glorantha, and provided a map of the entire world. With the 1978 release of RuneQuest, Stafford saw his mythology make its full appearance into print as the designers of the game utilized it in full. The cults of Prax, with their distinct religions that provided varied worldviews, provided players with a wide array of options for their characters to utilize. Cult of Terror brought in the concepts of evil gods, as well as a vampire cult to provide evil adversaries for GMs to throw in. As RuneQuest continued to grow and supplements continued to be released, Stafford continued to take advantage of its popularity to build upon his mythology by writing or co-writing several of those expansions. He even wrote a novel in 1993 that added more expansion to the mythology than what he had previously intended. 1993's King of Sartar went beyond what he'd intended, as it was the first publication that wasn't aimed at the tabletop role-playing game audience, and the material was never intended to be adapted for that purpose. Avalon Hill's acquisition of RuneQuest in the 1990s saw official expansion of Glorantha come to a halt since they didn't get the rights. However, when the internet began to evolve later in the decade, fans of the game began to work up their own materials for Glorantha. And while these weren't considered to be official materials, enough gamers enjoyed sharing them online and using them that online trading of these materials became a mythology of its own in a sort of way. Other than the 1999 video game King of Dragon Pass, which was released by A Sharp, there hasn't been a lot of new official releases of Glorantha-related materials. Stafford has self-published a few pieces over the years in non-game form using the title The Glorious Reascent of Yelm, but most of that is previously utilized concepts in reimagined forms or updated forms for non-gamers. To give an overview of the world of Glorantha, why don't we just take our cue from the official Glorantha website? It says, Glorantha is an action-packed world of adventure. Gods and goddesses struggle here, with nations of people nothing but their pawns. The stormy barbarians, with their brutal but honest storm god, struggle against the lunar empire, led by the imperial sun god and devious moon goddess. Glorantha is an exciting world of heroes. Legends are being made by great individuals, many who are not even human beings. Some work with the deities. Other heroes and heroines fight against them. Glorantha is colorful and full of magic. Supernatural animals are found, ranging from unicorns to 7 types of merfolk and the goddess of lions. Glorantha is immense. If explored, it has different worlds and dimensions, whole realms where gods, spirits, and sorcerers' powers come from. Unlike many fantasy settings, Glorantha emphasizes religion, myth, and belief to a level rarely seen in role-playing and fantasy fiction elsewhere. Glorantha shares some fantasy tropes such as dwarves, elves, trolls, and giants, but has developed them differently to the more conventional versions based on the worlds of Tolkien. Dwarves are literally made of stone and exist as manifest, rigid, inflexible laws of creation, while elves are intelligent, mobile plants. Glorantha is full of surprises. Glorantha is as deep as you want it to be, or not. Hackers and choppers have what they want, while scholars and mythologists have a vast playgrounds of new stories, legends, and myths to enjoy. By the way, that website is glorantha.com if you're interested in checking it out. I mentioned a couple of the Glorantha-specific creatures a few moments ago when I was discussing RuneQuest, but I thought this might be a good time to get into a more detailed rundown, so let's do that real quick. The Brews are described as creatures of chaos. They can mate with pretty much anything, so they have the body of a man and features of their animal parent, which are typically deer, goats, antelope, cattle, and sheep. Kind of sounds like Quagmire from Family Guy. The animal parent typically dies and the child will eat their way out of the host at full gestation. Brew worship Malia, the mother of disease, and Thed, the goddess of rape and mother of chaos. Scorpion men are considered to be belligerent and are basically scorpion human centaur types. They are stupid, vicious, and live in violent matriarchies with a religious emphasis on devouring. They are chaotic in nature. Ducks are large, intelligent ducks with arms instead of wings. They reside around rivers and have an unexplained mystical affinity with death. Aldrami are plantmen. They are nature and sun worshipping. They mostly worship Aldrea, the deity of plants. Unlike the elves, they are alien, physically plant-like, and often hostile to normal humans, whom they consider to be meat men. They are also excellent archers. Mostali are a machine-like dwarven race. They are exceptionally xenophobic, orthodox, and insular. They are the inventors of iron, and that has extraordinary magical properties in Glorantha, which makes it very different from bronze, which is the primarily used metal. Uz or Uz are the trolls of Glorantha. They are the race of darkness. They're large, intelligent omnivores. They've got a well-developed dark sense as well. Their societies are matriarchal, and they worship a goddess of darkness called Kyger Litor, the mother of trolls, along with the more violent and sinister Zorak Zorin. Look, this is just a taste of what Glorantha is all about. Like I said a moment ago, you can get a deeper feel for it by checking out the Glorantha website or by picking up a copy of the RuneQuest gamebook. The website for Glorantha is glorantha.com. Let me spell it, glorantha.com. And you can get a copy of the RuneQuest gamebook from your local game shop or from the Chaosium website, chaosium.com. And with that, we've come to the end of today's tour. Next week, we're going to check out the Dying Earth role-playing game as well as Green Ronin's True 20 game system. In the meantime, check out Bad GM's campaign Build Along. This week, we wrap up Season 2 by checking out how my group ended the campaign. Then we're going to do the season post-mortem for both the build and for my group's campaign. And as I always say, there's never a worse critic for how I've done things than myself, so that should be interesting. Bad GM's campaign Build Along is available wherever you get your podcasts or from our website, badgmproductions.net. The theme for Role-Playing History is Beyond New Horizons by Giole Fazzeri, and it's available from pixabay.com. Role-Playing History is a production of Bad GM Productions. We're all over social media, so check out the info box for this episode or the website to see where you can follow us. And reach out to us with your questions or with ideas you have for future episodes. We do take those seriously, and I do love to use your ideas on the show. Next week, it's the Dying Earth and Green Ronin's True 20 game system. But that's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and your Role-Playing History.